My name is Ben Williams. I work for NGS Secure and I'm a penetration tester. And I've not been a penetration tester for that long, around about 6 months. But just after I started with NGS, I decided I was going to do some exploit development. So I started an exploit development project of my own. And this presentation is about that work. I chose to look at security gateways. And you might think, well, that might be kind of a tough target for a first exploit development project, but it's actually proved to be quite fruitful. So I found over 40 exploits that I've raised with vendors since October 2011 when I started this project. And when I say exploits, I'm not talking about vulnerabilities or potential vulnerabilities. I'm talking about proof of concept working exploits. So you do this and this, and you get session hijacking, and you do this and this, and you get a command shell, or information disclosure, or whatever it happens to be. And many of these issues are very serious and can lead to direct compromise of the security gateway. So during this presentation, I'm going to do a little bit of talking, and then show you a few exploits, and then a bit more talking, and show you some more exploits, and then have a conclusion at the end. So what do I mean by security gateways? Well, it's a kind of marketing term, and it covers a multitude of different products, but they mainly fit into two different categories. So you have the multifunction gateway, which acts as a network firewall on the perimeter, and it also processes other protocols, perhaps doing things like anti-spam, URL filtering, perhaps acting as a SSL VPN. And then you have single function gateways, which typically would sit in a DMZ, and they would do one job, for example, URL filtering or anti-spam. But you also have products which are kind of a little bit in between. In terms of the actual platform, it kind of splits up into Linux-based appliances or software which you install on Windows. And I've looked at virtual appliances for the research that I've done. And some of the examples that I've looked at are here. So for example, ClearOS is a multifunction Linux-based appliance. So the top few there are Linux-based appliances. So Proofpoint is a spam Linux-based appliance. Barracuda do various different appliances, and they're all based on Linux. And the WebSense and Symantec products that I looked at were software products that you install on Windows. So where do they fit in the network? So the multifunction gateways sit in the middle. So doing a kind of jack of all trades job, and typically used by smaller companies as a kind of single deployment that does multiple tasks. Whereas with larger companies, they might have a dedicated firewall and have an anti-spam proxy or web URL filtering proxy in the DMZ. Now, depending on where the device is deployed, very much affects the attack vectors. So the interesting thing I found about the multifunction gateways that sit at the network perimeter is that most of them, by default, have the UI, the management interface, enabled on all network interfaces, which means that by default it's enabled on the external network interface. And we quite often come across management UIs in external pen tests. So that's a kind of a direct attack vector. Whereas the products which are deployed in the DMZ, if the administrator has done his job correctly, the administrative interface should not be directly accessible from the outside. But sometimes the products have interfaces such as user portals, which are designed to be exposed to the internet, so that can be an attack vector. And even where the interface isn't exposed externally, you can attack these products reflectively using cross-site scripting and cross-site request forgery. So, as I said, we frequently come across things in external pen tests, and I quite often think, well, wouldn't it be nice if I could get past this authentication dialog, because this is potentially the firewall. So this is a product we'll look at a little bit later on. This is ClearOS, which is a multifunction Linux-based security gateway. McAfee's product, so McAfee have actually patched their product, found 6 exploits against this, and they patched it Tuesday of this week. So I'm going to talk a little bit about that, but it's still a bit fresh, so not too much. This is Symantec's message filter, which used to be called Brightmail. So Symantec purchased this about a couple of years ago, and they rebranded it Symantec, but they didn't do much in the way of maintenance on the product. So I downloaded the latest version of this product back in November, and it's a Windows installer, and it installs versions of Apache Tomcat and MySQL that were 7 years old, no patches and default content on the web server, so it kind of had exploits, third-party exploits out of the box. It also had some of its own problems, which haven't been fixed yet. This is WebSense Triton 7.6, which is mainly uses a URL filter, but it does other protocols as well. This had some authentication bypass and cross-site scripting, but most interestingly, it had unauthenticated command injection as system, which you get a system shell with. We'll look at ways that that could be used in some demonstration later on. This is Proofpoint, another product that we'll be looking at in more detail. Now, the interesting thing about this is it has 2 UIs. So you've got this, which is the administrative UI, and this, which is the user portal. So it's an anti-spam Linux-based appliance, and the user portal is for end users to be able to manage their spam. So, for example, if a spam gets blocked as a false positive, they want to go and release it, they can log on to here and manage their messages. So, quick look at my methodology. Basically, I'm visiting vendor sites, downloading products. Typically, the products that I'm downloading are virtual appliances. So a lot of the appliances are evaluated in this way because it makes the sales process really easy, but it kind of also makes my exploit development process very easy. So typically get a 30-day evaluation license. So I'll download the product, unpack the VM, run the wizard, and off I go. The first thing I'll do is blast it with automated scanners. Because it's on my equipment, I can afford to blast it with more than I would do typically in a customer-based web app test, because I don't mind if I DOS myself. But the automated scanners don't tend to pick up very much. They'll pick up things like poor cookie security, some reflected cross-site scripting, that sort of thing. The real interesting ones, obviously, is a lot of prodding and poking with intercepting proxy, and I use Burp. Most of my colleagues do. It's a great product. And because I've also got a VM, I can also SSH onto the device, typically, and look at what's happening on the device while I'm attacking it, and also do some code review. I'm not a developer, so it's not really my background, but I've found some exploits by looking in the code, especially useful when you're doing things like command injection, because it can be really helpful with tweaking the parameters to get things working. Then it's just a question of writing up the exploit. So I write a full detailed, this is how you exploit this, and then log it with the vendors, and then work with the vendors, periodically chasing them to try and get status update and find out what's happening with patching. In terms of kind of high-level vulnerabilities I've found, so 90% of the products I've looked at, so I looked at around 10 products. Most of them, vast majority, have got input validation issues. So there's a lot of cross-site scripting, so yeah, not particularly exciting. But when combined with session management issues and you can do session hijacking, then yeah, that's potentially interesting. Because these are appliances rather than websites, there's a lot of interaction with the operating system. So there's a lot of possibility for command injection, which is obviously a very powerful attack, because you've got features on these appliances where you can stop and start services, you can do troubleshooting and management, so you can often ping a device, do a DNS lookup, send an SMTP message, that kind of thing. So you can parameter tamper those functions. You can quite often get command injection. Cross-site request forgery is also very common. So I haven't found any of these devices which have specifically got cross-site request forgery prevention. Excessive privileges, I've found some devices that run the web server or other processes as root. We'll look at some authentication bypass and information disclosure in a bit. I've already talked about out-of-date software, so that occurs again and again. So quite often the web server or the database is a kind of old, unpatched product, third-party product. And most of the devices I've looked at are also vulnerable to brute force, so automated password guessing. I wouldn't really categorize that as an exploit as such, but just kind of interesting. Some of them don't even log incorrect password attempts. So the way I think about the attack is in two stages. First, to get access to the UI, and then secondly, from the UI, can I do command injection? And my end goal is really, can I get a root shell on the box? Now, it usually fits into two phases, and that's the way I kind of approach it. But sometimes you can get one phase where you can do, for example, unauthenticated command injection as system or root. And other times it's multi-phase, so you might be able to do cross-site scripting with session hijacking. You session hijacking a low privilege user, so you need to do some privilege escalation within the UI, and then enable SSH on, and then you find you're, again, a low privileged user, so you need to do some more escalation on the operating system, which is usually easy because there might be an old kernel, for example. Okay. So, plenty of talking there. Let's have a look at some things. So this is ClearOS. We're just going to have a look at the product to begin with, kind of show you a little bit around the UI. So these products are kind of quite common in the things they do. Usually the management UIs do both configuration of the product and management of the product. So you've got quite a lot of features within there. And quite often they're very, very well laid out. They've got good features. So I spend quite a bit of time exploring the products. When I was looking at this product, there's one thing that caught my eye, was a disk usage monitor. So you'll notice, if you can see, that most of the UI is written in PHP, but you've got a disk usage monitor here where you can browse the file system. You can see directory names, file names, and directory sizes and file sizes, but it's in a iframe, and it's actually a third-party plugin, which is a CGI app written in Ruby. So it's outside of the authentication model of the rest of the UI. So bear that thought in mind, and we'll come back to this in a minute. So oh. Right. So first thing we're going to look at is some information disclosure. Just hold that. So remember I said this is a multifunction device which sits at the network perimeter, and by default the administrative UI is enabled on the external interface. So here, as an external attacker, by browsing to this particular URL, we can see some confidential information. I'd usually rate this as a low, but you can see we've given away some good information there to an external attacker, such as IP address, host name. You could see, sorry, let's go back a little bit. You can see like the internal network interfaces, how much traffic is going on those. You can see disk usage. You can also see memory usage, and further down there was information about the actual hardware platform. So kind of useful to an external attacker, and as I said, it's unauthenticated. So the next thing we're going to look at is this file browser which I showed you previously, and we're going to look at it unauthenticated. So paste in another URL there. And here we're actually in the roots home folder. So you can see that the the file browser is working with a high privilege, and you can browse around the operating system and again see file names and file sizes. Now if we go to this special location, this is where the PHP session tokens are stored. And there's one session token in there. So we click on that, it gives us the session token. Yeah, the actual session token is in the file name, and the file size actually tells you whether the session token is logged in or not. Yeah, so you can cut and paste this session token out of the page source, stick this in our browser. Yeah, so from here it's just simple session hijacking. Tidy that up a bit. Hit save, browse to the top. And in a second, we're logged in without logging in. So it was not always as easy as that, because you could have multiple session tokens in there. So I cleared some of them out, but you could basically check the session tokens and see which one was authenticated. It also had multiple session management issues, so it had very long session timeouts and session fixations such that if a user logged in, logged out, logged in, logged out, the session token never changed. The file browser actually does snapshots of the operating system, but because of the other session management issues, it made it actually very easy to do this session hijacking. So we've got onto the device as an external attacker, we now control the policy and the management of the system. So you can think, as a network firewall, you could disable the firewall or other protections that the device provides, and you effectively control it. Let's see if we can get a command shell, because that's always what I'm looking to do. So this is where we are at the moment, high level view. We've come in and we've taken control. Let's look at command injection. So there's usually various options for finding command injection, such as things that stop and start processes or do management tasks. The thing I found in this product was there's a backup and restore function for policy. And I found this in other products as well, but what this basically does, the backup, it backs up specific files and folders to a tar gzip. But when you do a restore, it unpacks the tar gzip from the top of the file system as root. So by adding arbitrary files to the tar gzip backup, you can overwrite any file on the file system or add any file. So here we're just going to add a cron job, which does a reverse netcatless shell connecting back to our attacking system. And in a minute or so, we'll see that pop up. So there, guys at the front will probably see that's UID 0. So we've got a system shell on the box. And if I do an IGAF config, you can see I can see the internal interfaces. In this case, I've just got one, but there may be more. So from a high level perspective, now we're here. So at the very least, we're in a position to do very powerful man-in-the-middle attacks, because all inbound, outbound network traffic is going through this box. It's kind of, to me, it's like coming in the front door and opening up the network like a tin of peaches. The irony is that this product has been put in place to protect the network, and you're using this product to break into the network. So it's kind of interesting and fun. Post-exploitation, a lot of these devices have useful tools on them for an attacker. So for example, if you didn't get a root shell, you may want to do some privilege escalation. Quite often you'll get something like a C compiler or other programming languages. TCP dump for network sniffing. Netcat, I've found things like mmap. Application managers, so you can just add whatever packages you like such as yum and apt-get. Stunl for doing network encryption. Of the systems which were more hardened, none of them are really hardened very much. So, for example, I didn't find any SE Linux, and it's rare to see systems that have got no read, no execute partitions. So The main problem of gaining access to the UI there was session token disclosure. And you might think that's kind of rare, but I found it in a few cases, which is kind of interesting. So this is McAfee's product. As I said, it's been patched this week. Now, this is a better product. It's got more defense in depth. But you can see here, we've got something quite similar, which is another file browser where you can see session tokens. This product had role-based access control where you could have multiple users. So you could have a user which could just do reports, users which could do administrative tasks, and then like a super administrator that had complete control. But here users can see each other's session tokens if they're logged on, so you could use this for horizontal and vertical privilege escalation. There were actually other issues in the product which meant that that was much easier to do via other means, which I'm not going to discuss at the moment because it's a little bit too soon. But you can see it's a similar problem. And here again, in another part of the UI, you've got authentication session tokens used as unique identifiers in a log of configuration changes. So to me, that says that the developer didn't really understand what a session token is and what a session token means, because I wouldn't expect to see passwords in there, and I consider a session token as something similar to a password. Here in this other product, I had, so there's a lot of products have reflective cross-site scripting, which combined with session hijacking can be quite powerful. And most of the products that I looked at didn't have cookie security, such as the HTTP only flag, which stops JavaScript from accessing the browser's cookies. But in this product, you had reflective cross-site scripting and the revealing of an active session token in the same page, which meant that you could basically use the reflective cross-site scripting to pull the session token out of the DOM and then send it to the attacker. So this is an example of that. So basically, we're pulling some data out of the DOM and then writing out an image tag, which fails, which runs some JavaScript, which writes out another image tag, which sends the session token to the attacker's web server. So if you just look in the Apache log, you can see the session token coming up there. So it's a way of bypassing the cross-site scripting cookie protection, the HTTP only flag. So let's talk a little bit about scenarios. So the first product we looked at was a kind of perimeter product where you could potentially have the UI exposed. Now, all of the products I've looked at, I've managed to find Google Docs of the UI exposed. But in most scenarios, there are certain products that you wouldn't have direct access to the UI. But you can still attack the UI as an external attacker, even if you can never see the UI. And I'm going to show you some examples of how that can be done. But mainly it's done by cross-site request forgery or potentially on-site request forgery. So let's talk a little bit about cross-site request forgery. You're probably familiar with this because it's been used for years to attack users of things like social networking sites, where basically an attacker is feeding the victim a request. So they're making a request on behalf of the attacker. So you can do it with, for example, where you can do GET requests. You could put it in a piece of HTML. It's just making a request with a hidden image tag. Or if you have to do a post, you can maybe put it in a hidden iframe, something like that. But in this situation, you've basically got the victim and the attacker on the same level because they both know what the site's called. Now, because these products don't have anti-CSRF protections, they're all potentially vulnerable to this type of attack. And I've seen presentations and white papers in the past which basically describe attacks against home routers. You've probably seen this before. And this works pretty well because the way that manufacturers produce routers and ISPs deploy them, they tend to use standard addresses for the router, which means that the router address is known, it's at a known location. But when you come to look at the corporate network, it's more complex because you've got different addressing schemes. So if there's a UI within this network, the external attacker is not necessarily going to know what the IP address is in advance, and that's a really important piece of information. Also, you don't know who the administrator is, and how do you get them to click on your link or view your site. So there's some complexity there. So let's talk a little bit about the WebSense unauthenticated command injection system. So I thought it was a pretty cool attack when I found it, and kind of ironic because you could put together a URL that you could own this URL filter, so a bit of irony in there. So there's a lot on this screen. I'm not expecting you to really read this, but basically I put together this URL as a proof of concept. So all this is doing is, so %26 is a pipe symbol. So you could do, with a request, you could do operating system commands. So I've basically chained together a load of commands which write out some VB script, which download right at the bottom there, netcat.exe, and then make a connect back to my attacker's machine. I just wanted to have something that worked well in different browsers and on different versions of Windows, because it's a Windows product. So I thought, yeah, this is great. And then I started talking to my colleagues about that, and they said, well, okay, how are you going to exploit it as an external attacker? Because this is a product which is sitting in the DMZ, and it's, the administrative UI of this web filtering product. It's on a non-standard HTTP port, and you don't know what the address is of this box. I thought, well, how can I find a solution to this? I don't know who the admin is. I need to trick them into clicking on a link. I don't know the internal IP address of the product in advance, and maybe that non-standard port is locked down so that only specific users can access it. So those are the problems I need to overcome. Now, in external pen tests, we quite often are able to enumerate internal IP addresses of systems, and that's kind of very useful to an attacker. Very commonly, we find misconfigured websites or websites with vulnerabilities that aren't patched, that you make a crafted request, you actually get the internal IP address or host name sent back to you. So that could be really useful in this case, because if I find a web server in the same DMZ as this product, then I could potentially put together something like this, which is making a request. So say you guess a class C subnet, you could make a request to every box within that subnet. So effectively you're spraying the whole DMZ with requests. The ones that don't hit the product don't matter, because if I get one hit on the right product, I could end up with a system shell on the web proxy. That's one potential way of doing it, but it was kind of noisy and I wasn't that happy with it. And you also need to do some reconnaissance in advance to find the right IP address range. So then I start thinking about, okay, is there any other way I can do this? So this is a web proxy, and I kind of started thinking about the interaction between the browser and the web proxy. Now, when you configure your browser, this is a screenshot of Firefox. You set your proxy, and then you've got no proxy for localhost 127.0.0.1. So those requests are basically handled locally, and everything else is sent to the proxy. Now, what I wanted to do was have something that isn't handled locally, but is sent to the proxy, but when it gets to the proxy, it's handled locally. And the way to do that is to use a different address. So this dialog basically shows what you're defining as no proxy down the bottom there. Now, I looked at Firefox, Chrome, IE, and they all work the same. They basically do pattern matching on those addresses. You could add other addresses in there, but if you were to put in something that you didn't know about, like 127.0.0.2, the browser doesn't think that's a local address, so it sends it to the proxy. When the request gets to the proxy says 127.0.0.2, that's me. And it's been known for many years that there are millions of ways of representing different IP addresses, so you could represent this in lots of different ways. So what I'm saying is, if you were to put 127.0.0.2 in your request, then if an internal user makes that request, the request doesn't get handled by the local, by Firefox or IE locally. It gets sent to the proxy. When the proxy gets the request, it makes the request back to itself on the management port, which might not be accessible from the internal network. So the proxy is effectively attacking itself, writing out the VB script, downloading netcat, and connecting back to the attacker with a system shell. So you put together something like this. It's kind of the reason I've obfuscated these URLs, because it's quite a powerful attack. And then basically, because it's an unauthenticated attack, if any internal user were to view that page, the attacker can potentially get a root shell on the proxy. Have you managed to absorb that? So the next product we're going to look at is an anti-spam product called Proofpoint. It's and the first exploit we're going to look at is a little bit lame. It's kind of to demonstrate that not all the exploits I've found are command shells. So this one's kind of really basic, but it's kind of interesting to me because it is lame and basic. So as I said, this is an anti-spam product, and here we're putting in an incorrect username with a dummy password, and we get one result. And if we put in a non-existent user with incorrect password, you'll see we get a different result, which basically means you can do SMTP email address enumeration in an anti-spam product. Now, it's been years since anti-spam products have protections in the actual relay to prevent this happening, because spammers used to enumerate people's email addresses via the relay. So they have blacklisting, tar pitting, grey listing, various different protection mechanisms in the relay. But in this externally facing web UI, you can enumerate SMTP addresses to your heart's content. So that's kind of interesting. So let's look at a bit more sophisticated attack against this product. So as I said, it's anti-spam product which does content security. So it does things like antivirus, spam filtering, etc. So it's got various features to configure the relay, and the various sort of filtering that it does. But it's also got management features in the same UI. So if you click on this area here, we've got a message area where spam or virus or blocked executables messages go into. So what we're going to do is send in some test messages. So I've got a little script here to send some SMTP messages. And in these messages, I've put free Viagra in the subject line so that they're going to get blocked as spam. And we're going to look at the user portal first. So if we click on the quarantine area here, we can see those three messages have got caught. And if we go back to the management UI, we've got a similar sort of feature, but for all users. And click on that message area, and we can see those messages again. So this product had out-of-band cross-site scripting via email. So here we're going to send in some malicious messages which contain some JavaScript, which just do a simple JavaScript pop-up just to show what happens. So we send in 3 of those and flip over to the user portal. And click on the quarantine area, and we see 1, 2, 3 JavaScript pop-ups. And then if we flip back to the administrative UI, and go to the quarantine area, 1, 2, 3. So we sent in 3 malicious messages, and we got 3 pop-ups. So we can run JavaScript in the context of the end users, which we can also enumerate, and the administrator in the context of the administrative UI. So what could we do with that? I mean, I'm sure you can think of attacks against users, redirecting them, or getting them to do silly stuff. So let's have a look at some on-site request forgery against an administrator. So here within the UI, here's where you can define administrators. So you can add additional administrators. In this other area, you can enable or disable the antivirus protection. So I'm going to send in 2 more messages. The first one's going to add a backdoor administrator, and the second is going to disable antivirus. So if the administrator then views the message area, and then we go and have a look at where the administrators are defined, we see we've got a backdoor administrator. And if we flip over to the other dialog, refresh that page, and probably some of you at the front will be able to see that the antivirus has been disabled. So that's interesting. Thank you. So at a high-level view, we're sending in a message which we're deliberately getting blocked as spam by virtue of what we put in the subject line. The product's doing its job by blocking that message in the message area. And if the administrator is doing his job of regularly reviewing those message areas, the payload will execute, and the malicious payload will do its job of reconfiguring the product. So everything's doing its job and everything's fine. Obviously not. And you could probably think of other, you've got creative imaginations. You can think of other ways to exploit this. So for example, you could disable executable blocking, antivirus, anti-malware, anti-spam, and then spam in a load of payloads. Or as a creative attacker, perhaps you could put up a DNS server or SMTP server externally on the internet, and then reconfigure this product to relay all outbound messages via that system, thereby doing a kind of SMTP man in the middle. There's lots of different things you could do. How are we doing time-wise? I'll just show you this quick one, a little bit of participation. So I'm going to show you a little screenshot out of Burp, which when I first saw it, I thought, ooh, that's really interesting. I'll see if you can spot what the problem is. So this is an authenticated request in Burp. What's the problem with the request? Look at the session token. No, so this is it's actual request rather than a set. So take a look at that cookie. No. Yes, good spot. Who said that? Well done, yeah. So you've got 24 characters there. 9 of them are A. Yeah, and this is one of these problems that as I looked at it, it got worse and worse. So this is collecting the session tokens with Burp Sequencer, and you can see that not only have you got loads of A's, this bit at the beginning is not changing at all. And you've got an E there and an 8 there that aren't changing. And then if you do the Burp Sequencer statistical analysis, that's what I got, which is obviously pretty poor. And it was worse than this because obviously you've got potential for prediction there, but unauthenticated and authenticated session tokens, although not the same, they were closely related. So basically you could poll for unauthenticated session tokens, and when an admin logged in, it actually changed the sequence of the authentication session tokens so that you could predict within 4 or 8 guesses what the actual administrator had been issued. So that's kind of an interesting one. So in conclusion, I've had a lot of fun. Exploiting gateways, offers a very powerful position. There's a very wide range of issues. So some of them are quite easy to find, like reflective cross-site scripting and session hijacking. Some more difficult to find, like the command injections, things like that. But the most interesting thing, I think, is all of these techniques I've used pretty much are well understood for years. And if you were to read the Web Application Hacker's Handbook, you would find all this sort of thing in there. So I feel that there's a big knowledge gap between people who are designing secure websites and people that are designing security UIs of security products. That's my kind of big finding. So It's a rich area for further research. I've looked at about 10 products, found about 40 exploits. There's lots of similar products in the same market, and I'm guessing they've got similar kinds of exploits and attack vectors. A colleague of mine, Daniel Compton, has also started a similar project, and he's looking at network monitoring software. So he's looking at things like WhatsUp Gold, Nagios, Manage Engine, and he's already found 35 exploits. And he's found similar things like command injection, authentication bypass, cross-site scripting, SQL injection, all sorts of stuff. And I'm going to start looking at SSL VPNs and more specifically at anti-spam products. So that's it. So white paper on the DV goes into some more detail. Company website there, my blog. Please fill out your feedback forms. This is the first time I've presented at a conference like this, so I'm interested in your feedback, and so is BlackHat. And if you've got any questions now, I've got a minute. No, less than a minute. Any questions?
Which products have the most issues with the US?
The one I've seen so far, Proofpoint, I've raised quite a lot of issues with them. Any other questions?
The converse of that, which products did you find were particularly
The Sophos Astario gateway I've looked at a couple of times, and I've found that very hard to find any exploits. Interestingly, though, Jeff, who did a presentation yesterday on the transitive trust of SSL gateways, so gateways that are decrypting and re-encrypting SSL, he actually found some issues with Astario that he's relayed to them. But I've only specifically looked at the product UI. I haven't actually looked at what the product does and what the features it provides. So I can't really endorse any particular products.
You know you got 20 minutes, right?
Don't think so. Any more questions? Okay, thank you very much.